Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webcast. As part of our information governance series, today's program will provide you with the steps to developing a records retention schedule. We're very excited to have all of you on board, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. My name is Anne-Marie Cochia. I'm Marketing Director here at Canon Business Process Services, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Before we get started, I would like to make you aware of next month's webcast covering the top 5 data security issues that threaten information governance. It will be held on Wednesday, May 4th at noon Eastern. We will email you the link to register as a follow-up to this program for those that are interested. Now back to today's program. We have a few quick housekeeping notes. We are recording today's session for those unable to join us live. To eliminate background noise, all participants have been muted. You will only be able to hear our presenters speak. If you would like to ask us a question, you may do so at any time by clicking the chat button in the WebEx dashboard on the right side of your screen. Type your question, click send, and we'll try to address your question before the end of today's program. Because we only have a limited time, we apologize in advance if we are unable to address your question online, but we will be sure to follow up on any unanswered questions after the webcast. As part of our webcast series on information governance, today we will be discussing the records retention schedule component of the governance program. First, we will set the stage with the information governance framework, then discuss the steps you need to take to develop a successful retention schedule along with the sample schedule. Lastly, we will cover the lessons learned and the resources you can use. We will have a few minutes at the end for Q&A. Just want to talk briefly about who we are for those of you not familiar with Canon Business Process Services. We are a division of Canon USA. We focus on enabling clients to improve operational and business performance. Our services include business process outsourcing, an improvement in areas such as accounts payable, student financial aid processing, claims processing, as well as other paper-intensive workflows. We develop information governance programs and assess and implement retention schedules in the realm of what we will be discussing today. We also help clients improve back-office processing, develop a records management program, and manage mail center services. Our discovery services business offers consulting services to technology to project management. We do facilities management and perform corporate campus logistics services in addition to materials management. Lastly, over the past 10 years, we've been recognized as one of the top 100 global outsourcing providers in the International Association of Outsourcing Professionals. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. Dan Spingarn has over 15 years of experience in records and information management. He has implemented projects in the highly regulated insurance and legal industries, as well as in federal and state governments. He works with clients from the initial assessment of current state and analysis to the implementation, measurement, and ongoing management of the program going forward. Ben, we're so glad to have you on board today. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise and insights.
Thanks, Anne-Marie, for that introduction. Today, we're going to be discussing the steps to developing a successful retention schedule. And we're going to start by putting the retention schedule in context with information governance, and the records program in total. The retention schedule is really a foundational element. For those of you who have joined us in the past for the Canon series of information governance talks, we want to understand that we're really looking at a phase 1 item. You'll note that we have a bullet of corporate goals and the regulatory requirements, and the retention schedule is truly that piece of the foundation. It's that piece of the foundation. So we're going to go through a few things. The records program as a whole is definitely a part, or includes the retention schedule, and we're going to touch on that as well, how the policies and procedures help define with the retention schedule the behavioral expectations associated with an organization's information. And so we're going to go through a couple of the common steps associated with these pieces and the retention schedule specifically in terms of how to develop this, and provide some insights into how each of those step pieces affect the overall formation and final deliverable that you're going to put together. I did want to make one acknowledgement, which is that at times this discussion is going to be very granular in nature. So those of you who have been living day in, day out with retention schedules and information management in general, this may not all be news to you, but where there is something new and interesting, I'll definitely be highlighting this for you. With that, let's move on to the foundations of a successful retention schedule. So first, and this is the only time you'll hear me reading directly from the screen, I wanted to define the retention schedule as a whole. So the retention schedule identifies the types of records created by the organization, their active and inactive periods of use, and when or if they become eligible for permanent removal from the records collection based on their operational, fiscal, legal, and historical value. That definition actually came from a book called Records Management in the Legal Environment that was written in 2003. It's still very much applicable. But we need to understand that the retention schedule exists as a part of an overall program and the program incorporates the policies and procedures as well. The policy, the records policy, is the document that's approved and endorsed by your senior management. So this is what is used to communicate to the people within your organization the expectations that the senior management team has of them regarding the organization's information. But it's also an attestation. It actually tells the outside world how the organization governs and relates its information, how it handles it overall. So it provides guidance. The procedures themselves is the final piece, the sort of tripod of the records program, and that essentially tells us where and how we're doing the work itself. The one thing that's maybe an unstated aspect of the overall records program is that success really needs to be defined as having an actionable retention schedule, having an actionable program, so that you can take meaningful action from all the work and time and effort spent in developing the program, the retention schedule itself. So from there, we wanted to actually poll our community that we have here. To what extent has a retention schedule been implemented in your records program? You should be able to respond to the poll question that should be appearing to you now.
So we would very much like to hear from our audience today, and just select one of the responses here, whether you've not started a program, whether you've developed a retention schedule, whether you have a retention schedule in place but not implemented, or you've implemented but not maintaining the schedule, you've fully implemented the retention program, or you're not so sure. So we'll give you a few seconds to log in your response. And we do have a large group today, so we'll just wait a few seconds more. Okay, Ben, so I see here that many of the folks on the line have a fully implemented retention program. We have that at 25%. 21%, it seems to be moving around a bit still. 20% have not yet started. And it seems the numbers are pretty much spread between developing a retention schedule at 15%, they have one in place but not implemented at 10, and then they've implemented but not maintaining the schedule at 15. So are these numbers surprising to you?
They are to a certain extent. So what we typically find, and I'm guessing why we're getting so many responses on E, and you're attending our cast here, is that you have a fully implemented retention program, and you're looking for ways to either optimize that implementation and make the overall program better. And then we also have a lot of folks who are just getting started. So for you, this will really be able to give you some insight into how to get started in general and the things and considerations you want to take into account. So the first place we're going to start is why we typically have a retention schedule. Why do And more to the point, why are organizations interested in usually getting started with having one or making sure that it's in place? And we want to acknowledge that the common refrain that we typically encounter is that the retention schedule, by putting it in place, is considered a kind of magic bullet to help control spiraling offsite storage costs for paper records and for minimizing the amount of internal infrastructure, i.e., hard drives that need to be used for the organization's information. That these costs are generally escalating, and the people interested in getting started are typically, seeing them on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, and realize that they aren't really as small as they think. In terms of those that have encountered litigation or audit events, there is a recognition that the retention schedule can and does help with the effective management of risk, which is a more positive approach to rather than just looking at the cost deficiencies. But we also lately have encountered that there's a recognition that some information that exists within the organization in the archives out there can actually help the overall organization improve its stance within the industry, to improve its and optimize its processes. There's a host of information points that can help the organization as a total, and the retention schedule is a part of that by helping to identify what those valuable work products are. But we typically encounter that the reality sets in right about the time that you're trying to actually implement the document itself. That the implementations typically are more complex and expensive than are expected, and that a lot of the process, if not carefully approached, you can have a lot of folks from the operations side, the business owners, that give you these various reasons to keep their material for forever. There's this common refrain that, we're just afraid that we'll need it at some point and therefore we should hold on to it. And typically those same business owners, really the costs associated with retaining information indefinitely or for longer periods of time becomes somewhat invisible, because per unit, a box in storage or a gigabyte on a hard drive just doesn't cost very much. And one of my early implementations of a retention program, I was sitting in front of a lawyer, and he was very polite and listening to everything I was talking about in terms of information governance and retention schedules. And he said, well, I agree with everything you're telling me, but be aware that I bill $1,200 an hour, and anything you want me to do to help these programs need to take that into account. I nodded thankfully to him, and really that gave me a firm understanding that for a retention schedule, and more to the point, its implementation to be successful, we have to take into account all the costs associated with it up front, and to the extent possible, mitigate them. Which does add another layer of complexity to the actually getting started with your retention schedule in the first place. So I wanted to jump, though, first into getting rid of a little bit of that complexity. Some of the information you see here, actually all of the information you see here, is from Gartner. And it really shows you a little bit of how they view information, or how the industry truly does. What the graph shows us is that there is an escalating amount of data that is coming into our organizations, but over time it rapidly loses most of its value and creates an increased risk and cost, the escalating costs. So the other point, though, here at the very top is that non-records documents and data truly only need to be kept usually for 12 to 36 months at maximum. So there's a definite value in not just identifying the records that exist within the organization, but what isn't a record. And that is definitely part of the overall retention schedule process. So based on my napkin math, if we declare a whole host of complex information as non-records, that means we're getting rid of it at a much earlier phase in the overall process. And it just makes for a great reduction in the retention schedule development itself. And one more piece of Gartner information. When we contrast the fact that shorter periods of time are generally required for non-records maintenance, we do find that most organizations are identifying that at about the 7-year mark that information can generally be minimized or eliminated. And the reason for that 7 years typically is that information is created in a context in the absence of statutory or regulatory requirements, after about a 7-year period, the context tends to disappear, that people move on and the reasons for retaining a document are no longer immediately apparent. And therefore, they represent no value. That document doesn't represent value to the organization. So let's jump into the keys to a successful retention schedule project. And I do mean project because we need to approach it from on a project basis. So the first thing we want to understand is that, and this is probably not news to a lot of the folks on the call here. We do have a number of participants at this point. The first is that we do want to form a committee. When we say form a committee, though, we want to include not just the records individuals, the people that typically are engaged in this process. We want to include information technology as an absolute must. And then we want to incorporate the risk teams. So we want the compliance, risk, and legal folks to be involved. And, of course, we want to have an IG perspective, so either the admin and facilities or the records information governance folks. Each of these groups typically has its own perspective and needs associated with the retention of information. And they need to all have a voice to help you through the overall process. Particularly legal can help smooth away a lot of trouble that you'll run into later and make the overall implementation less complex. And we'll get into how that works in some later slides. But I did also want to call out one other group. You do want to have some business owners on your team to help give voice essentially to your customers, which is the overall organization. Because while they may want to keep everything indefinitely, they can give you perspectives on how and where they're using information that is quite valuable to the overall, gaining the overall endorsement of the organization as a total. In sum, you do want to take also that project management approach. In the past, we would, as records and information management professionals, develop the retention schedule and put it out as a final mass deliverable. What we found is that by taking a more iterative or agile approach to the overall retention schedule, that we get far greater buy-in by having discrete smaller successes early and often. This also helps you overall in identifying your timelines, because some of that early motivation is truly around that quick hit of getting rid of things that are in your storage silos. You want to be able to have that unrealistic expectation that your retention schedule is going to suddenly appear and blow away all this material, addressed as early and often as possible. Get rid of unrealistic expectations. And while this is probably not news, you do want to have set your duties and roles and responsibilities for your committee. The idea for the committee is not just to meet periodically and talk, but to actually to work on and create deliverables to address challenges as they occur. This is a working group, not just a group to sort of socialize ideas. We also look at getting a champion's approval. In the end, you're going to need a top-down approach for the application of the retention schedule to the overall organization, because there are costs associated with implementation, and generally records and information management expenses are looked at as a cost with little return. So if you're using the bottom-up approach, there are definite challenges, whereas the top-down, unfortunately, is generally the way to go to have a success in terms of putting it in place for the organization. And again, I know I've been talking about costs, but the cost mitigation truly has to be at the center of the decisions that are taking place within the committee, so that every time a new decision is made, we're asking the question, does this exacerbate or mitigate the overall cost of what we're going to try to put in place at the end of this process? So from there, we also have one final acknowledgement, that the committee is there to both develop the overall retention schedule and the program as a whole, but then they're also there to maintain it, that the committee's role doesn't end when the final retention schedule is put in place and approved, that they're there to manage the challenges and exceptions that are going to occur with your policy schedule and procedures, that they're there to help do the updates that are going to be necessary, because again, you're taking that iterative approach. So you want to ensure that that institutional knowledge, especially up front, remains with the committee as it transitions into the maintenance phase. So we're finally down to the 5 steps for successful retention schedule development. Some of these may look very familiar to you if you've been in the industry for a while. So we're going to be formulating a strategy, creating a records inventory, doing research on that inventory result, developing the actual deliverable itself, the retention schedule, and then finally looking at adoption and implementation of the schedule. When we talk about formulating the strategy, we want to identify as many of the considerations that the organization has as a total. We want to formulate a general scope of how records exist within the organization. We typically identify this as being people, technology, and process, or people, process, technology, however you like saying that. And you want to understand how these pieces all fit together because they get down to how you essentially organize your retention schedule by record series. This is where we're going to start getting fairly granular. How you set up your record series, in turn, affects how you actually do your research, and in turn, provides you with the minimum levels of retention and cost associated with the implementation and your ongoing processes. How does this work? Well, by identifying things in the people and process category, we want to understand who creates the organization's records. Here's where we can start highlighting some best practices. So when we're doing the creation of who is involved with the records, we want to create a list of business unit stakeholders by area to ensure that we have both a thorough listing of the different owners of processes, but also who is involved with the creation of the records, not just the sort of the top level owner, but the people who are contributing to it. This is a best practice here is to use what's called a Reiki matrix or a responsibility assignment matrix because by interviewing a larger set of folks, or at least having them available within your interview process or able to contribute to the people you do interview, you'll have a better buy-in from the operational groups because you've guaranteed that a number of folks have provided their voices to the overall process. Where are the records created and why are the records created? It is a best practice to create a workflow document as early as possible into the creation of the retention schedule because you want to understand the different touch points and truly where a record becomes a record, or a document rather becomes a record. This helps you have more pointed conversations during the inventory process with the people that you're talking to and will overall provide you with better results in how you're going to organize your record series. When it comes to technologies, you want to understand what platforms are used within your organization, both legacy and current, because knowing the platforms available to the organization up front allows you to do data mapping, which provides you with the input and output points of your organization's information, and again allows you to have that more selective conversation of what the record is. And more to the point, how consistent or available is the metadata in those systems. This gives you really great insight there. Metadata, in essence, dictates how much remediation and cleanup you're going to have to do when you have your final record series in place. And by understanding the metadata in your current system, whether you just have file names or you have value-added information available to you, this gives you a good sense of long-term budgetary costs when it comes to implementation, so you have some of that reality hitting up front rather than being a little bit surprised when you go to figure out how you're going to implement it on the back end. You also want to understand how the technology will support and enable the retention schedule. Records management systems typically have pretty good retention rule capabilities, but when you get to electronic content management, so you're talking about the electronic versus the physical, the rule sets are completely different and may not be parallel. And then there's, of course, the Wild West of the shared drive management, which really the tool set's completely different, is more related to e-discovery. So understanding and documenting how these factors affect your organization will greatly improve the records inventory process in total. So what is the records inventory? In essence, the records inventory is a list of the organization's records that defines the attributes associated with those records: who owns the record, what system the record version resides on, how long the record is maintained in an operational state. These are all captured as a part of an interview process. But more to the point, you're also at this point formulating what is the record series and defining it in a discrete and identifiable fashion. So there are two functions you want to understand here, and again, this is very granular, so I'm going to touch on it briefly. If you have more questions about this later, I'm happy to share them at the end of the session. For structured content, in the past, it's very common for retention schedules to be on a document level, on an individual record level. And this is sometimes appropriate for structured content, where you have one record equals one document. The problem with this is that it creates more errors in total and only really works well if you have a way to automate the overall process. So when you encounter structured content, something that has a uniform presentation on a regular basis in your inventory process, you might think to yourself, this is a good opportunity for a one-to-one relation. It's far more common to encounter unstructured content, where you need to understand the relationship between different documents to one another and how that can be grouped into a record series. This is the most common approach these days to the inventory process. And while you're doing the interviews is the time to make sure you understand these relationships and to document it effectively. You'll also be capturing the volumes and usage of the records within the organization and determining the overall records life cycle, because you need to have this content available to you for when you're doing the research process, and in the end, defining how and where you want to apply your resources to the organization's information. Usually high volume equals high resources. The method for the overall creation of the inventory is that you're going to both have a questionnaire and then use that questionnaire with your interviewees. To that end, the questionnaire is a sample is there on your right, maybe a little hard to read, but we're happy to talk through the different pieces that we typically ask about here. This version has the department name, type of documents, if they're vital or not, what repository they exist in, and so forth. You would, of course, create your own that's based on the systems and platforms that you actually encounter as a part of your considerations conversation. And we're going to move forward to... So I already touched upon this one. If there are, again, more questions here, I'd be happy to roll back to this slide. But I'd like to skip it for now because, again, maybe a little too granular for this presentation. When we're doing our pre-interview preparation, we're creating our questionnaire, our inventory form, because we want to ensure that everybody that's in our conversation tree, all of the people that are on our committee, all the people that are conducting the interviews are asking the same questions in the same way of the different people that they're talking to. And we want to make sure that we're recording the information in the same fashion so we can do easy comparisons between the different types of conversations we've had. We can take this questionnaire along with the request for the process and records documentation that we've already made. If we have a process map, that obviously helps. And we can create a data map. So we now have a process, we understand the processes, we've got the data mapped out. This is a best practice that is less common and takes a little bit more time, but can actually help out a great deal when you're having your interviews. You want to create or query your records management system and create a proto-inventory. So the purpose is not to skip the interview process itself, but to take the information you already have and get a better understanding of the types of record series that are already in place for your different organization business units. And you want to understand the consistency of your metadata up front and how unified it is between stakeholders within the same business unit. How are they capturing their information? Is it the same way or is it different? By studying this pre-interview inventory along with the process maps and the data maps and so forth, you can have more of a working session around defining your record series and spend less time just doing information solicitation. So you can rapidly speed up how you're going to approach this.
So Ben, excuse me for one moment. I see we do have a chat writing question from our audience. How do I decide which records to be inventoried?
So at this point in the process, you really have to do a complete and total records inventory. You aren't going to know up front what is or is not a final record because you haven't done the research yet. You haven't figured out if there's a statute and a requirement associated with what you're doing. So you really can't stop at this point and say this is not a record. You have to record everything you have out there and then make that determination after you've done your research. But thank you for the question. So who to interview? So I have two individuals here, or you're going to interview everybody who's in a part of a department or a business unit. You want to have that as your sort of your base layer, as opposed to interviewing everybody in the organization, which if we had infinite time would be great. But how many do you want to interview? For highly structured content, you can actually get away with a minimum of 2 individuals. Truly, for highly structured content that is uniform in presentation, the first person is giving you the majority of your data, and the second person is essentially confirming it. When it comes to semi or unstructured content, you want to use at minimum a group setting first to get as many of the different kinds of approaches you're likely to encounter with your records information up front. And then you can decide at how many individuals to follow up with. At minimum, you're looking at that as 2 individuals. If you're very lucky with your unstructured content, people are approaching it in the same manner and there's some uniformity. If you're unlucky, then you may end up spending a bit more time going through the weeds of how the different individuals throughout that part of the business address their information. You also want to have your information technology and information services folks in every single one of your meetings. You truly need them to be there because some of the responses you'll receive are as a result of legacy systems being in place and less as a result of how the business wants to operate or theoretically would operate if something was different within their overall platforms. And IT can help resolve those questions for you. When it comes to the records research, the requirement for any retention schedule and the organization as a total is the records must be kept at least as long as an organization is legally obligated to do so. And there's a couple of ways to do the research, which have a pro and con to each. You can research on a local level, so that would usually be on the state level, which actually has the least cost and time associated with it because you're researching fewer overall statutes and requirements, and in some cases, the national, i.e. the federal or the other states may actually be requiring you to keep things for longer than the state that you happen to be in which case, if you're doing it only on the local level, you actually get to retain your information for a shorter period of time. The downside is that the downside is actually the pro side of doing a national level research, which is if you have the national level research, then your information is much more portable. You can move it between states without serious concerns or concerns on that level. International research is a whole different conversation. So I'm just going to mention it because it would look funny to not have that identified, but we're not going to go through it on this particular presentation. When it comes to the actual national level review, there are a couple of different places that are going to give you results for your research. There's going to be the federal state statutes and citations. Those are your kind of primary sources. And then there's going to be opinions of those statutes that are considered secondary sources. The final area that you're going to run into as you do your records inventory is that some areas will have no citation whatsoever. So there's no technical legal requirement for the organization to maintain what it is declaring a record. At this point, you're going to be very happy that you had that legal group on your overall committee because you're going to need a legal opinion, either through your legal group or through a third party that's interacting with them. But you need to be able to decide, is this item now, in fact, a record or not? And if it is a record, what is the record series should be and how should the operational standard be put in place? So indeed, that legal group where no citation is available is a resource you want to have prepped and ready to go to fill in a gap that you're almost certainly going to encounter. When it comes to the research itself, I have an example here that shows the kinds of results you typically run into. This one's based on some IRCH programming and some results back from a third party. You're going to have the specific references and the details associated with anything that you have on your records retention schedule. You'll have the listing of the item, and then you'll have a code that tells your folks where to look for the citation, statute, or opinion that's applicable. and that acts as a reference key on the schedule to this grid that you're looking at here. You want to attach this to your overall schedule because as a kind of tab, if you're thinking of this as an Excel grid, because one, it shows evidence of your behavior that you've gone out and done the research and you understand the requirements for the organization as a total. And when it comes time to do your updating, you want to have this available so that you understand what you should be comparing this year's new requirements to in the overall format. When it comes to the retention schedule itself, typically we organize the retention schedule by department or business unit, and then we have a couple of decisions of do we want it to be by functional area or just as the business unit as a total. Each has its advantages, or the integrated approach where you actually incorporate both functions. How does this work? Well, sort of if you're in legal, and I'm using two examples here, your area of law may be the highest level for the record series. So if you're in the litigation department, you know that all litigation matters are retained for a certain period of time, specifically the longest period that your individual document types exist within. Corporate works in a similar fashion where you can do it by department or you can do it by a specific process. And again, the document types that roll into those processes or departments give you the high water mark. If you want to be aware, as you're building your retention schedule, that there is a divide between electronic and physical retention. You can map your retention schedule to have a direct equivalency where if you have an area of law, and by way of example, that you have your folders and physical files organized by area of law, and you have your electronic files organized by area of law. This has the advantage, the very distinct advantage of having all of your items sort of lumped together in one general section, but it does mean that you're going to retain your material for a longer period of time because, again, you have to use that high watermark and there's more content within that big equivalency. The other approach is to use an official record version of electronic or physical records. So you've decided essentially which item, or whether the physical or the electronic is your final version, you're going to get rid of the other version. But you need to be aware that if you take this approach where you declare an official record, that prior to any disposition activity that you take on, you actually need to cull through and make sure that the version you're eliminating has a direct equivalent in the version you're keeping, which can add to the overall labor required for the retention and the disposition processes. Your retention schedule should also have the supporting evidence. We've gone through that. And also change management. It's very important to have a section within the retention schedule that's maybe not published to the overall organization, but is retained by the committee that shows what decisions were made and why, so that over time, as either committee members leave or statutes change, you have some other reasoning for keeping a rule the way it is. When you go to do your adoption and implementation, the standard process is to have the departments that contributed content to review the overall deliverable that you've put together and understand and agree to the content that's there. They'll also be identifying at that point what is a vital record, something that has to be there as a part of the organization. So that's your DR and COOP requirements. And your IT group is also going to be taking a look because they need to understand what the final requirements are for them, it's both from a vital record standpoint and the record series and understanding that concept. But this is where, again, where you want to have your legal team get involved. This is a good point, particularly to have any excessive operational need that's been identified, particularly if it doesn't equate to or a citation or statutory requirement, that they can help you go through and have this review process if they're sitting there with you and ask that question, is this really necessary? And they can often help you cut back the number of items that have to be retained for excessively long periods. It's also a good point for them to ask the question, this item does not have a citation, do we really need to declare this a record? Any items that you can have as a non-record mean that you can get rid of it at a much earlier phase in the process, and it's a completely different discussion at that point. It can help you cull back a great deal of the overall organization's material. When it comes to implementations, we need to consider a few things. Publication and dissemination. That's your change management and training, and then budgeting to those considerations that we've got there on the right, and we'll go through those in a second, and how much automation is possible as a result of your retention schedule. For the budget considerations, you need to be aware that there are going to be additional folks most likely involved on both the maintenance of the records, because in some cases you're now requiring people to take on best practices from a records management standpoint, but more to the point, compliance and risk review. What that means is that you need some people that are verifying that your retention schedule is actually being enacted and handled in a manner consistent with the retention schedule itself. You're also most likely going to need some new technology and tools to help you control the overall behavior and the workflows associated with the creation of the records. You will need to do a yearly review. Statutes change over time. You need to make sure that you're verifying that your retention schedule is still valid to the actual requirements from a statutory standpoint. Data remediation. At some point, you are going to need to correct, most likely, the material you have in your back file. Whether that's in offsite storage or electronic files or the metadata attached to these items, there will be a need to go back through and make corrections so that you can apply consistent rules to your material and retention through the business rules you set up. And finally, change management. Often there is a major need for both the training for the rollout perspective and onboarding. But more to the point, you may need consulting, because in the end, a lot of us on this call, creating a retention schedule is not our first and foremost job, and we have, membership in the committee or the process as a secondary item, and bringing in outside consultants, whether it's to help us with the data remediation factors or to actually execute on parts of the implementation, can greatly cut down on the timeline required to put a retention schedule in place. For our sample, and I see I'm starting to run up against time, so I'm going to touch on this one quickly, is that you will note that our record series here is by accounting, and that is in truth our total area for this one. We've identified the file types and the descriptions, so we've identified the types of records we're likely to encounter and what they incorporate, and we paired that to a research code, which then would go back to that citation, that grid I showed earlier, where you understand what the statutory requirements are. I find this one interesting because if you notice in the official retention, there are 3 sections, 3 items, that actually don't have a statute, that don't have a requirement, and it's just by the operational need. Where we have that operational need, we also tend to put in comments from the interviews, because we need to understand the types of items that are taking place from on the operations side and their requirements. These are just showing us where they're retained. At the bottom there, you'll note several tabs. We want to identify that, in this case, is similar to an Excel grid, that we keep multiple different items within the overall retention schedule. The field wouldn't receive all of this. They would receive their section of the retention schedule. But as a full deliverable that the committee has access to, it shows us all the different rules that we put in place, the legal research, the revision history, that's that commentary on behavior. That's all part of the final deliverable that we put together. And if there's any questions about how we put together our sample, I'd be happy to review those with you at a later time. To wrap this up a little bit, we have a couple of lessons learned that we want to put in place. First is that, again, that iterative approach is the preferred method of getting a retention schedule in place. That you need to recognize that perfect is unlikely to occur up front, and that you're really aiming for actionable. You want to have something that you can actually take and take some action on. You're inevitably going to run into files buried in legacy systems or unmanifested box and offsite storage. And at some point, you need to understand that worrying about that up front will just delay taking overall action for the organization. The reason you're maintaining that committee is because post-development, they are going to have to handle those exceptions, that material that jumps out and needs to take some form of action on. Or you may have some kind of physical disaster. Here in New York, we had Hurricane Sandy that put a real crimp in some of our client storage. And we just need to understand that that committee, post-development, is going to handle those exceptions. They're going to document them in the change management and the behavioral control sections so that those decisions are well understood and documented throughout the organization. So as we're running down on time here, I'm just going to mention that no matter how well crafted the overall retention schedule is, there are going to be situations that require modification to it as you discover new documents or record series that are necessary, or from specific situations that will occur to the organization. We have a couple of items of reading material here. I think they're good items to sort of as cues on where to start, and we just recommend them as essential reading. From there, let's wrap up with a few next steps as a little bit of a recapitulation or capture of what we discussed earlier. We want to secure that VP champion. Best case at times is if you find somebody that does have a specific challenge and you're able to wrangle them into your retention committee, then this makes convincing them a lot easier because they already have a specific problem that they want to address and they believe the retention schedule can help you. You want to form that multifunctional committee. Remember, you want legal teams involved, you want the IT folks, and you want to have that voice of the customer, those business unit owners. We're developing a sound strategy around how we're going to approach the organization's records. So we're doing a little bit of homework before we jump into the actual interview process and defining what the success factors are and the considerations that need to be put in place for the interview process itself. From there, we can finally jump into the interviews, and that's sort of where you're going to get started and start running into a lot of your most of your challenges is once the rubber hits the road. At some point within this rubber hitting the road, you may find that you're experiencing some challenges you weren't expecting. And at times, it's worth bringing in additional consultants to help on this. So this is my one area where I'm going to mention Canon. We have a specific process that we use. For some of you who have been on this presentation before, we've gone through some of the details of that. But we do have 20 years experience in developing the retention schedules, and there are areas that we can certainly help with to expedite the overall process. Please feel free to contact either myself or Canon as total, and I think we have that on the next slide available to you.
Ben, I do see we have one writing question here. I think we have a minute or two, and the question being asked by a member of our audience is regarding data remediation. If you change the retention period, can't you change it going forward, or do you have to go back and change assigned periods from the past?
That's an interesting question. So your retention periods are going to be uniform to the record series that you have in place. I have seen that you can declare certain pieces of information as long as they can logically be grouped to be a kind of legacy record series and apply a separate retention. The problem with that approach is that from a statutory standpoint, if they are rough or complete equivalents, that you actually have to have the same retention period. And I see that the same person has written in a second item.
Suggest ways to discover legacy records in old systems if there has been large staff turnover, so knowledge is lost.
Yeah, so I would be happy to send you some suggestions on using e-discovery tools and other active file discovery platforms that are methods that you can then pull that data and then do a review process and kind of put that in place as part of your inventory. That is definitely a problem. But again, that goes back to that interesting decision that if you're finding old data in an old system, that some of that, and to a great extent probably a lot of that, the context for the organization is now gone, and it's actually not worth keeping this material, unless of course you've defined it as a record. But at this point, that conversation was probably a little bit more than we can do in a minute, so I'd be happy to address that through some emails if that works for the question asker.
So thank you for folks that were on the call today. That concludes today's session. We hope you found today's insights helpful. For those of you who would like to learn more about how Canon Business Process Services is helping other companies develop and implement a retention schedule, you see the email on the screen here. Please contact us directly and we'll be happy to continue the conversation. As you leave us today, please be sure to answer our quick survey to provide your feedback on today's session. We very much would like to hear from you. We use this information to develop topics and for future programs. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.